was a researcher who was doing an academic project on a particular milliner, and I was thrilled to hear that the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum, told her that I was Canada's foremost authority on vintage hats. So I was kind of pleased, you know.
How nursing and psychology kind of helped you to become the researcher, the museographer you are today?
I'm not sure how it helped, other than the fact that in the early 90s, I became ill. Well, I had a chronic illness, which flared up in the early 90s, and I wasn't able to continue working in nursing. And so part of my therapy, when I started walking again and stuff, I was just walking around town, going into shops, and I just happened upon beautiful old hats that had been discarded. I kind of fell in love with them. I'd always been interested in hats, but at the time I felt that these were, of course, in the 90s, of course, you know, hats had fallen out of fashion. So I felt kind of like the hats did. They were just thrown away in a bin with some old shoes on top of them. A lot of them needed steaming and things. And I kind of felt like that I was just coming out of an illness and knew I couldn't continue in nursing, but wasn't sure what I was going to do. I didn't feel very useful. And it just developed. But talking to people about them is what gave me a real passion for them, because women had so many personal stories related to the hats. And it was a big part of women's history that just had fallen by the wayside. And when I started to collect them and people heard about it, women would give me beautiful hats with, you know, special memories, maybe of a wedding, or they were presented to the Queen and had to wear a special hat. And they said that they had tried to give these pieces to mainstream museums, but the museums didn't want them. Hats had fallen so far out of fashion that museums, even costume museums, were showing costume of previous eras without the hats that they would have naturally been worn with. So I understand that storage, of course, was a big problem with hats, but still. So I just got them by default. These women just thought that they didn't want them to turn into a Halloween costume or something like that, because they had really treasured the hats. So they gave them to me, and I was really fortunate. And of course, I bought hundreds and hundreds as well. I would go to thrift stores and flea markets. And it's funny because little kids were interested in these old hats. And often I'd come upon a child with the parent who was shopping, you know, at a flea market or something, and the kid wanted to buy maybe the same hat that I wanted to buy. And I find that kind of interesting. And I would always say to the vendor, I'll pay you more, you know. And also the labels give a really interesting social history.
You have a collection of thousands
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
hats.
And I want more. There's no explaining it. It's interesting because I've also always been interested in dreams, which I also worked with in my nursing practice and beyond. And once people found that I was collecting hats, they used to say to me, so I guess with you, it's everything about the head, is it? Well, not really, but I guess there's an overlapping, but I mean, I've kept dream journals for decades. And once I left nursing and started to do other things and writing, I would occasionally look back at a dream journal, and I discovered that decades before I ever started collecting hats, I had been dreaming about hats. And at the time, I would think, why am I dreaming about hats? One of those weird things you can't explain.
You are also a writer.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How do you use this unique skill that you have as a writer to talk about hats?
It's all about story. Every hat tells a story, and some of the stories are so poignant. Many of the hats that people told me stories about have not survived. But those stories are just as real as the stories that go along with the hats that have survived. Doing hat presentations over the years, we've met so many people who were just charmed by hats that they remembered from the past. And the memories that they evoke are so touching. One woman told me, I think I was showing a hat from maybe the 40s or the early 50s. And she said it put her in mind of a hat. She'd had her, might have been her, I think it was her tonsils out when she was about 9. And she said, that was a scary thing. And when she was coming out of surgery and, the throat was sore and she'd been worried about the surgery, she said, her mother came and her mother was standing over the stretcher in the hall, and she looked at her mom, and her mom had on this dear little hat that was very much like the one I was showing. And she said as soon as she saw the hat, she knew that she was okay because her mother had taken the time to look really pretty in the hat.
The hat that you're wearing right now, is by someone that you know?
Yeah, I bought this maybe 10 or 12 years ago. It's by Karen Gingra of Lilliput Hats in Toronto. And I just fell in love with it. Well, I fall in love with them all, really. My favorite hat is always the next one.
I was wondering if you have a few hats handy to show them to us.
Sure. I'll start with this one. This is Victorian Bobby Dazzler, and that's a term, of course, that originated in Britain. The idea was if you were a wealthy woman in the Edwardian era, you would show your husband's wealth by the adornments on a hat such as this. The basic hat underneath is black velvet, and then all of these feathers and flowers and adornments are held on with hat pins. So a woman would purchase a really good base hat, and this style would sit very high on the head above upswept hair. And sometimes it was stuffed with tissue, or the inner crown might be stuffed with false hair. So it would sit very high. Picture the kind of Gibson girl look. And but you could change the trims on this hat according to what you were going to wear that day. So any major city like, well, same as in the States, but here in Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, there would be emporiums with tables and tables of the latest trims, from Paris. And gentlemen would wait on the ladies and let them know what the styles were and sell them the adornments. The feathers themselves on this piece are ostrich, of course, in these gorgeous colors. And I think before I ever even started collecting hats, I was given a relative's vintage feathers. They had belonged to Mrs. Florence Clark of Clark's Pork and Beans. So anybody who remembers eating Clark's Pork and Beans, they probably contributed to Florence's feather habit. Yeah. In Victorian times in particular, the same with jewelry. The more lavish the jewelry and the adornments, you had to be of a certain age to qualify to be able to wear all that. Yeah. So hats were always designed for an occasion, a social group, an activity. It had to kind of tick all of the boxes. Well, what's kind of fun now is that, you can wear any hat you like. There are no more boxes to tick, except for one. If you're invited to a wedding and you decide to wear a hat, and the mother of the bride wears a hat, you really should not remove your hat until she removes hers at the reception. This hat, I'm really into straw right now. I'm doing some written work on the history of straw and how straw factored into the millinery industry, the different uses of straw and how it's put together. This one is really fun. We moved a year ago January, to Nova Scotia, Lunenburg, And there is a milliner here in town. And of course, I had to go. She hangs out a shingle that says hat junkie. So I knew I had to meet her. And this is one of her creations. And the funny thing is, when I went into her shop and was looking for something and saw this, I loved it immediately. And it was quite different from the other hats that she had on display. And I said, oh, I really want to try that one on. And she got it down, but she kind of hung on to it. And I thought we were kind of having a tug of war. And so I said to her, oh, I'm sorry, is that a piece that you don't want to sell? And she said, oh, no. She was just surprised that it was what I wanted, because she said when she made it, it wasn't her intention for the hat to turn out like this. I hope I'm not telling tales on her, but she said quite honestly, I wouldn't call it a mistake, but she might have that day. But I said, oh, no. I mean, I absolutely have to have this. So, so I thought that was amusing that was the one piece I had to have. And I thought, oh, she's not going to let me have it. She makes some wonderful pieces. She uses, and this is like all handmade from start to finish. So the straw, look how fine it is and how narrow. That comes on a bale. She has a wonderful old historic straw sewing machine. I think it must be at least 100 years old. And so consider, starting there from the center crown and stitching that in concentric circles. So I think maybe this fabric is vintage as well. Yeah. Maria Kiersick. This is one of her pieces. This is like not one of my museum pieces. It's a personal favorite that I purchased from Maria. I can't say enough about her designs. She's she's been, I think this is her 30th anniversary, and she was making and selling hats when really people were not wearing them maybe as much as they are now. She uses vintage trims, which of course I absolutely love. There's so many great things to say about her pieces. I do a lot of traveling hat shows, and when I'm presenting for an hour, and I need a hat that's not going to move, and I can order from her online, and the pieces, they come, they fit, they don't move, they're gorgeous. So a little fascinator. And of course, with all the fuss over royal weddings in the last decade or more, reporters all get excited about fascinators, and you would think that they were something brand new, but really they've been done, as many classic styles have been done again and again. They were done in Victorian times, they were done in the 20s. So it's so great to have them back.
The Canadian women, was there a trend in Canada in terms of hats?
I wish they were trending more, but I will say that I was quite surprised. I mean, when I first started the museum in 1999, I used to say, hats were so out of favor then. People weren't even wearing winter toques. You'd be laughed at if you were wearing a winter toque. And I used to say, hats are coming back. It's just a blip on the screen in fashion history that people are no longer wearing fashion hats. But what surprised me was that fedoras came back first. Those little, it's a variation on the classic fedora. But for women and men, they started coming back for the summer. People are now the stores are showing hats again, winter hats, of course, but even some felts and fascinators too. And I think all the royal interest might have sparked a bit of that. I'm not surprised, because each generation falls in love with something we've fallen in love with before, and I think more recent generations haven't had sort of the connotation and the association that some of us older women have had, because it was always so many imperatives, social imperatives around the wearing of a hat. You felt that it had to be the right hat. That's gone by the wayside now. And there were some very good reasons why hats fell out of favor. We think about the great age of millinery was really from about the 1770s to the 1970s, and everything that went in between. So now it's kind of like, it's being refreshed. When I first started interviewing milliners in the 90s, some of them told me, Canadian milliners, that they had to go to Australia in order to learn the skill. That puts me in mind of a show I did, I think it was in the Toronto area. And it's funny because I never knew, like, I like to change the rotation according to season. With so many hats, you know, I have a lot of choice. So the shows that I do, they're not always the same. I might always bring a Bobby Dazzler or, you know, classic style from every era and every type of style. But, you know, I change it up. And I remember this one time, you know, I had the rotation all ready to go. And I picked up this hat and I thought, oh, I really should take this. It was just a feeling that I had. But then I kept putting it down because I thought, no, I don't really want people to model this one because we have some hats that are more precious. I don't want people modeling them. And many hats that we do allow because that's how we show our pieces. But so I thought, it was like a tug of war again. But finally I took it and I ended up showing it. And I mentioned that it was by Toronto milliner Philip Ward. And then after the show, two women approached me. One woman was in her early 90s and her daughter was with her. And the daughter said to me, oh, my mom just had to come up and talk to you because you mentioned Philip Ward. So obviously I had brought the correct hat. And she said that she had taught Philip Ward how to block hats back in her millinery career. And she was all very proud of him. He was very well known and always in the paper. And he had a lot of socialite clients. He made Elizabeth Taylor's wedding hat the second time she married Richard Burton, I think. So she was really excited to see this hat. But she was so excited to hear that I had said millinery was coming back that she told her daughter she wanted to restart her career. And I mean, she was excited. And this woman was in her early 90s. So to me, it's a feeling thing. I don't know. One of my favorite eras is the 1940s. When you consider how creative the milliners were, especially since they had so many restrictions. Of course, with the war on, there were restrictions on the time they could put into making fashion and the fabrics that they could use for hats. And they got so creative. So this is really quite dramatic. And I love these original satin ties. We've got some aigrettes here. A little bit of veiling, some pieces even that might have been vintage at the time. It looks very old Hollywood in a sense, doesn't it? And yet the base of the hat is very simple. It looks as if it may have been a straw pillbox that had been cut down from the 30s. And often that's what was done during the war years. And then it's just sort of pinched up inside with some hand stitching to give it the shape and to give it the vertical nature. During the war, it was actually debated in Canadian and British Parliament as to whether hats would be rationed. And it was determined that there was no sense in rationing hats because you could make them out of anything. And also hats were a spirit booster. So during the war, if you had a lot of vertical adornment, those were called victory hats. So it was to lift people's spirits. And what's so cool about that era to me is the silhouette that the hats were worn with. I know my mother and her friends and her relatives, when the men went to war, they got into the men's closets and they pulled out the guys' suits and they remade them for themselves. And so it's that type of a silhouette that looks so great. I have a nice old bonnet here that I want you to take note of the ribbons. These are original silk French ribbons. This is from the Edwardian era. And they're shredding, of course. They used to weight the silks with chemicals or minerals like silver and, of course, when they're exposed and over time, they begin to shred, which is a sad fact of the life of these beautiful silk pieces. This is handmade lace from an earlier era, and a lot of the lace from the Victorian era was recycled. We weren't the first to do things like that. I love all the handwork of these little dangles. And the inner crown, of course, has some old lace that surrounds the face as well. There's a lot of handwork in this, but it's very dramatic. It's almost, if you think of black ascot after the king had died and everyone wore black and white, this would not be a hat you would wear to the races, but just, you know, from that era, that beautiful combination of color. I pulled a few just to show variety. This is a lovely one. This one is, it's a Panama straw. And of course, Panama straw is the lightest that you have. And then this wonderful inset of Battenberg lace, I think is just so charming. This was donated to our museum by a woman who wore this as her going away hat for her wedding in the early 30s. And if you picture her, obviously she must have gone south for her honeymoon, but just imagine the sun coming through the beautiful lace and probably dapple on her face. And this one is quite charming as well, but very avant-garde. And I do have a passion for pieces that are avant-garde. They're just so interesting. That when this came into my possession because I had gone to a coffee shop in Toronto, and it's wintertime, not that that really matters, but there was a woman sitting in this coffee shop, and she had an outrageous hat on. And for me to say a hat is outrageous, I'll wear, outrageous hats any day of the week. But I thought, ooh, who is this woman? Like, this is so interesting. And so I purchased the coffee, and then I interrupted her. She was sitting sketching. And I said, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. I didn't know she could have been a tourist. I didn't even know she spoke English. But her name was Miriam Kehaney. She's a designer. We stayed quite a while chatting. And at one point she said, I'd like your opinion. And she was sketching a hat. And she said, I'd like to make a hat that looks like a collar, a man's collar. She said, what do you think? And so I loved the sketch. I said, yeah, I love it because it does make me think of a man's collar. My father always wore those detachable collars in the 50s. He was also a minister, so he wore clerical collars. This also, to me, has a nursing cap vibe. It's like words. They have different connotations, and so do hats. So yeah, I think that would be great. So this was her prototype, and I purchased it from her once she had made it. So
how do you take care of them?
That's a good question. Yeah. I was just going to say, though, I would love to have her sign this hat. I need to tell her that. How do you take care of them? Well, when you have 3,000, I would love to be able to afford archival storage for all of them. Of course, the most precious are in, good archival boxes with acid-free tissue paper. I also have a large collection of historic hat boxes, which they're beautiful just because of their graphics, their design, but they're also iconic of their era in many ways. Many of them have a 5-digit phone number on the lid. When did we have 5-digit phone numbers? Many of them, of course, it used to be a status symbol, to walk out of a shop with a hat box on your arm. And I think that morphed into, I know when I was, a little girl in the 60s, it was a status symbol for me to carry my Barbie case to my friend's house. I think it kind of morphed from that. So many of the hats are in hats from their era, but it'll depend on the shape, and the best way to support it. I'm a real nerd about storage. I was really excited when I visited the Dugald Museum out west, and they showed me their, what do they call it? Or at least at the time, they had visible storage. They had hundreds of hats, and they stored them as they did their costume in a visible way behind clear plastic. But what they did was they padded upturned ice cream containers, the plastic ones, and then set the hats on that. So when they're, pulling for an exhibit, they can see what they're pulling from. Right now, because we moved a year ago, not all of my hats are with me at the moment. I'm still finding some storage here. So some are still behind in Ontario and some are still behind in Montreal. But they're coming, and got to make a place for them. And restoration, I do rely on a conservator if I have a problem with a hat. But for the most part, they come to me in very good condition. And a well-made hat, I know that Beau Chapeau in Niagara-on-the-Lake, now they have that second shop off of the first one, and they are remaking vintage pieces. The raw materials that went into the really good hats of old can still be worked with. They're surprisingly, some of the ones we find need a bit of cleaning, but it's a case of a gentle brushing with cornstarch sometimes, will revive an old felt hat, steaming, of course.
Last year you had a big exhibition in Lunenburg. Are you planning something similar this year?
I have had a couple of inquiries about, we still do our traveling hat shows, which are done in a fashion show format, but I'm doing something a little bit different this time. I'm very charmed by Lunenburg architecture and some of the way the old buildings have been preserved. And sometimes there's what I call forbidden spaces within the buildings. So I'm doing a forbidden spaces exhibit. We're starting off at the local library. Some of the location, like the stairs to a higher level that, there's no access to, that's not accessible to the public. It's ideal for placing the exhibits on the stairs, just roped off, and it makes use of the space and it gives some attention to the hats. And there's a couple other places in town that I have my eye on. And, if anyone else out there sees this and, has a forbidden space that they'd like a temporary exhibit in, and that's one new initiative that we're doing. And also, I used to present a lot of vintage fashion exhibits. We start with the hats, but also 1920s clothing, Victorian clothing. I have 5 books on vintage fashion, so different collections, Titanic era, that sort of thing, to retirement residences. The residents just loved it. It takes them down memory lane, and so I've left those clients behind. And some have asked me to do video presentations now that I'm a few provinces away, so we do that as well.
You wrote a book about your grandfather.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Based on the letters that you found from him?
That's when I was sick and I was confined to bed for a number of months. And, I had, that's before I ever started collecting hats. But I got a little tired of that. I knit a toque for everybody I knew. And then one day my mother came and she said, you might as well have these letters. So it was a blue velvet box that my grandmother, Harry's widow, had kept from the war. And they were letters from her husband from just from basic training right through to when he was killed at Vimy. And my grandmother had kept them, then my father had kept them. And my mother said, you know what? You might as well have your inheritance now. This is your inheritance. You're to get these. I lay there and I thought, oh, well, this might be interesting. And they were not in order. It was just a big box, beautiful box. But all I could do was kind of pick a letter, read it, put it over here, and they were in all different order. So once I got mobile and was starting looking at hats and moving around and stuff, I really decided to put them in order, and I wanted to have him tell his story because I didn't think it was a typical war story. And his personality came through so well. My grandmother had always spoken of him, but of course he died when my dad was 2, so I never met him. But when you read a letter, it's first person, present tense. Someone is speaking to you. Doesn't matter that it's 100 years ago. You feel you're corresponding with someone. So I really felt that I got to know him. And, but I wasn't sure if he would want me to publish them. And my mother was very private, and she thought they were love letters, should be private. And so I had that concern. But I went ahead with it, and then still not sure. I thought, well, maybe I'll just compile them for the family. But then every morning I would just go to my computer, and I had put them in order, and I would just take the next letter. And I hadn't read them all before. And one night I dreamed that, now I did mention before that I've studied dreams for years. And so I keep dream journals and draw sketches. And so I dreamed of a cannon, and I felt I needed to draw this cannon. And I tried and I tried and I tried. But honestly, it didn't look like a cannon. It looked like something phallic. And I thought, well, this isn't working, So I gave up on that. But then when I went to my computer, the next letter, on the stack for me to, put on in my notes was a letter from my grandfather to my grandmother. And he had purchased some kind of a souvenir from one of the battles. And that's what he liked to do. He had sent her a few pins throughout the course of the war. And he also made a lot of sketches in the letters that he sent back. And so he said, I'm sending you, he said to her, the latest pin that I've purchased for you. And he said, but I didn't draw a picture. He said, I can't draw a cannon. So that's the same day that I'd had the dream the night before. And I woke up, So I felt that was his way of giving me permission, maybe. I just felt really connected. Yeah. He was a career soldier. And he and his brothers had enlisted. And he felt very strongly that, there was the saddest part that I came across in the book really was that he was so good at training other soldiers that they wanted him to stay in England and train soldiers and not to go to the front. But he purposely failed an exam so that he could fight at the front. Otherwise, he wouldn't likely have been killed. And that was another connection I feel I had with him, because for a silly reason, when I was in high school, I purposely failed an exam. So, it's a silly thing to do. But who does that? So I felt like I had a connection there with him as well. Yeah.
You returned to school, mature woman.
I didn't know you knew
back
that.
To school quite late.
I did. And I'm proud to say I was on the dean's list throughout my second crack at university. So, yeah, I believe in lifelong learning. It was a good experience.
What is your oldest, from what time is your oldest hat?
I have what's called a Theodore bonnet. That's probably from the 1700s, I think. It's not in the best shape. I would say that we have several bonnets from around the 1850s, probably would be the biggest collection, sub-collection of the oldest. Yeah.
Up to the most modern postmodern?
Oh, yeah. I still collect, yeah, contemporary pieces as well. Yeah.
Were you able to get a grant to help you collect these hats?
I haven't tried. I haven't tried. Um, I'd love to have a permanent facility, but I think it was a benefit that when I started, I did not. I think more people have seen the hats because I had to travel than if I'd had a permanent facility. We moved from Ontario. I was last in Burlington in Ontario.
And did you show in Ontario as well?
Oh, all the time for 20 years, more than 20 years now. We had exhibits at museums, the library, retirement residences, so many locations. You know, a lot of fundraising groups would contact us and have us present to them. I presented to about 400 people one time at the Royal York. Yeah, people, just word of mouth, people heard about it. Nursing homes even. We did a fashion show at a nursing home. It's not a traditional fashion show, but, and the nurses told us afterwards a lot of their patients responded to the hats in a way that they had not responded to anything else. We did an interview with a radio show one time, and well, it was a CBC Fresh Air, and I thought, oh, good, because we were on breakfast television and, you know, a lot of different media, and I thought, oh, finally, we're going to have an interview where I don't have to bring any hats. But they said, you know, no. Bring us some hats so we can talk about them. So hats spark interest, you know, and they lift spirits, and they have so many stories to tell.
Do you collaborate with schools?
I have done some. I haven't had any inquiries at the moment. Probably will. Mm-hmm. Regarding the hats themselves and social history, I find one of the most interesting aspects is that they're representative, I think, of the women's movement. If you think about the Edwardian era when the suffragettes were advocating for the vote, those great big wide-brimmed hats came into fashion. Gentlemen at the time wore club pins on their hats, which was kind of a status thing. And the women got the idea that maybe they needed something like that to enhance their status. And so you saw the evolution of the great big hat pins, which of course complemented, you know, the broad crowned and wide brimmed hats, which you needed the pins and false hair to be able to wear a hat like that. When some of the women were arrested, those hat pins were taken away. The idea was that those hat pins could have been used as a weapon against the authorities, you know. And there's debate about that as to whether hat pins were ever used as a weapon. The newspapers of the day had letters to the editor from men saying that, you know, they might have been injured by a hat pin when they were on the streetcar or this or that. But some people say that that can't be true because there were no lawsuits brought, but what man would want to admit that maybe he, as my aunt told me, my great aunt, she told me to always carry a hat pin because she had used one once to stab some guy on the streetcar who'd gotten fresh with her. So nobody wanted to admit, you know, that someone used that in self-defense against them. So I think, you know, it's kind of a silly thing to say in one way, but I think, imagine the DNA you might find on some of those hat pins, you know. And of course, once the women had to attend court proceedings, they didn't have their hat pins. They looked disheveled. They couldn't, you know, so it was demeaning. And then you have, of course, you know, in the 1960s when, well, really, yeah, circa the end of the 1960s, early 70s, when women stopped wearing hats altogether. They just gave up on the whole social imperative thing. And it wasn't until about 1965 in Ontario, I think, and probably the other provinces around the same time, that they changed the law about women being required to wear a hat if they were attending court proceedings. So men, of course, were required to wear ties as well. But, you know, if you didn't have a hat or a fashionable hat, and every season came with a new fashion, it would work against you because people would know. You know, bailiffs had big cardboard boxes filled with cast-off hats that probably were crushed like the ones that I've been finding, you know, to restore. And, you know, you would look poor. So, and then, of course, with the protests with the pink-eared pussy hats now, this is the third wave. So I find it's very interesting that hats are tied to that. And there's so much interesting fashion history around the suffragette movement. Certain colors that they wore, their suffragette jewelry. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. What's interesting as well, I wrote an article a couple of years ago about arsenic in old hats. A lot of the pieces that museums are holding, now that includes taxidermy hats that were put on, I mean birds that were put on, and mice too, on Victorian hats. They still, some of them still contain arsenic. And so there are special ways to handle these now. And some of them should be tested. So I think that's quite interesting, that it can still be active because it was used. You know, hats are beautiful and they've always been, you know, sculptural works of art, but there's some ugly history behind it. You know, that the people in the workrooms that made these things and how they did. You know, we know about the Mad Hatters with the mercury used to cure the felt and how that was a neurotoxin. And then, of course, there's people got very, very sick from doing the taxidermy. Their skin would turn green. You know, some of them died from handling it. So
It's so new for me. I never thought of fatal hats or poison.
Fatal Hats, what a great title. Fatal Hats, yeah. That's good.
I always looked at them as glamour or, you know, things like that, or protection or
Yeah.
showing
Yeah.
a certain status. I never thought like in that political or, you know, other
Yeah.
villainous way or.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting.
Regarding the hats, do you have any recommendations for hat lovers?
I just recommend the hats themselves. I want people to wear hats. They lift people's spirits. I hope people wear them this Easter. I'm tired of being the only one in church that wears a hat. I want to parade around the town in a hat. Hug a Milner, support a Milner. That's my recommendation. Try on a hat. I don't know why people are shy about it. You know, protect your skin.